we're still here and we're still in the business of shaping policy and advancing development. And now we want to look at the details of the bilateral agreement between Nigeria and Qatar, an outcome of the meeting President Tinubu had in that country. And we're being joined by Dr. Yele Okeremi, who is the CEO and MD Precise Financial Systems Limited. Glad to have you join us, Dr. Okeremi.
Good morning. How are you doing today? It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Great. What a pleasure to be your host this morning. Now, let's look at this decision to sign a bilateral agreement with a country like Qatar by Nigerian government. What do you make of this decision and how strategic it is to have this kind of bilateral agreement with a country like Qatar? Give us a background to this.
Well, absolutely not a bad decision at all, and indeed can be said to be smart. So the way I look at this kind of situations is simply saying that anything that gives a nation leverage is welcome, and anything that allows Nigeria to expand its influence is welcome. And when I say expanding the influence of Nigeria, it may not necessarily be momentary, but anything that gives Nigeria the potential to expand its capacity and to expand its influence is highly welcome. And I suspect that a whole lot of this is what's going on between Nigeria and Qatar. So as far as I'm concerned, just as long as the agreements are not lopsided in a manner that allows Nigeria to have the short end of the stick, it's absolutely welcome to me. And I think I saw a few of the snippets of these agreements, and they actually look exciting to me.
They have been signed between Nigeria and Qatar. Now, this is a multi-sector bilateral agreement. It cuts across different sectors. There is one that has to do with education. Now, Nigeria coming to sign an agreement between between Nigeria and Qatar to improve education. What would that mean for both countries? In what way do you think benefits will come from this agreement?
Now we need to unpack that particular aspect of it. When we say we have signed a bilateral agreement involving education, does this suggest that Qatar is going to provide certain opportunities for us to train certain people in Qatar, or does it suggest that Qatar is going to come into Nigeria as investors into the educational sector? Now, whichever way it goes, either they allowing us to send specific disciplines to Qatar to learn under terms that are very favorable to us, it's bright. Or if Qatar is coming as investors in the educational sector, it's also very welcome. Remember, the bottom line is that the world has moved away from the extractive industry to the knowledge economy. So, I mean, if you looked at the world some 20 years ago, some 25 years ago, the richest countries, the richest people in the world were people that had access to natural resources, extractive industry. So that's where we saw the Saudi Arabias, we saw the Dubai, even the Qatars, and we saw people that, even Nigeria, countries that had oil, countries that have natural resources. But today you can see that the game has changed completely to the knowledge industry. And the same thing applies even at individual level. The richest people in the world were the Rockefellers, who are into oil and gas and the likes. But today, take a look at the world, the richest people are knowledge-based people. And so the major and most pivotal ingredient to knowledge is education. And that's why the bottom line is that if Nigeria is actually going to get out of the rut that we currently are in, the most important thing to my mind is its human resources. So we can look at Nigeria in two ways in terms of our population. We are, well, I don't know, depending on what statistics you are following, But let's just agree that we are about 200 million Nigerians. The question that you ask yourself, is this an asset or a liability? A 200 million population will be an asset if you have majority of them that are geared and tuned and well trained to productivity. But of course, the converse will happen. It will be a huge liability if you have majority of Nigerians that are unproductive and unable to be geared for production. So you realize that the bottom line is that how much training, how much capacity do we have is very, very critical. And it doesn't matter where we are today. I think we have to keep our eyes on the future. And the future tells me that we need necessarily to pay a lot of attention to education.
All right, let's look at the decision to talk about the regulation of employment of workers with government of Qatar, the establishment of a joint business council. Trying to quote the statement reference to the president, talking about the regulation of employment of workers with the government of Qatar and establishment of joint business council. How do you see this playing out, and what would be your recommendations on these agreements and how to maximize the advantage, as the fact that the Nigerian president was also able to market the viability of the Nigerian youths, talking about their energy, the level of education? How will this play out?
Now, I haven't seen the details of that agreement talking about employment between both countries, but I will suspect that what we will see in this document is a situation that allows or gives preferences to citizens of each of these countries in the other, meaning that if Nigeria were to bring in certain quota for expatriates, perhaps we want to give Qatar some preference, and then we also expect Qatar to do the same thing. I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, actually, because if you take a look, see, the concept, let me use the word, the concept of the Nigeria Diaspora Commission had been mooted many years ago. But the concept at that time as mooted is slightly different from the way it is currently being organized. Because my idea at that time, about 27 years ago, thereabout, when I thought Nigeria needed a Nigeria Diaspora Commission. Because remember, what we are calling JAPA today is not new at all. It started long ago. In the 80s, that was when the Andrew I'm checking out came out. And at that time, my concept is Nigeria needed to have a Nigeria Diaspora Commission. And my idea is that what the Diaspora Commission should have done or should be doing is such that rather than allowing Nigerians to roam or rove around Europe or the streets of America trying to seek contracts or employment for themselves, some of them are not probably well positioned. What the commission should do is present Nigeria as a country that has skilled and skillful population, and on behalf of Nigeria or Nigerians enter into contracts with other nations, having gotten a directory of qualified and well-trained and educated Nigerians. And then they can enter into other countries like agencies and get contracts on behalf of Nigerians to go work in those countries. And what are you doing at that particular point in time? You are virtually exporting, your human resources to those countries, but under specific agreements. And my suggestion at that time, and still remains what I would have expected, is that the commission will say that every Nigerian that goes abroad under such agreements will be free to work overseas for, say, a period of 5 to 10 years. However, the wages of such Nigerians are theirs, but the way it will be done will be such that 40% of the wages will be paid to these Nigerians abroad in the local currencies of the countries where they live, just for them to be able to live and have expenses. 50% of those wages necessarily need to be repatriated to Nigeria, which then becomes a source of foreign earning, and it also becomes a form of liquidity into the foreign exchange while 10% will be withheld as fees by the Commission for the purpose of training and developing the next generation of Nigerians to be able to go do these things. But you see, it's not only good for you to export human beings, it's good when you have a lot of excess capacity. But the bottom line is part of the things that the Commission should also be doing is working directly with the productive sector in Nigeria, with the Ministry of Industry, to ensure that Nigeria also becomes industrialized, such that a number of the skills that are being exported under the Diaspora Commission will be able to come back to Nigeria and become productive in Nigeria. So Nigeria begins to strengthen its own self as an industrialized nation, while in the interim using the capacity that we have built under the training and education to earn foreign exchange. I think these are things that are very possible, and that's why I say that I think that if we unpack this particular agreement, it may be a very good thing at the end of the day.
All right, as we continue to unpack the different agreements that have been signed, let's look at cooperation on youth and sports. Is Qatar really into sports? What benefits would that agreement bring to the sports industry in Nigeria? But looking at cooperation in terms of youth and sports, what should Nigeria be looking at in harnessing this agreement?
That's it. You see, when you said, you asked the question, is Nigeria really into sports? Have you forgotten that Qatar hosted the World Cup? Look, let me tell you something. Any nation that has financial muscle can virtually achieve a whole lot of things. Now, the way I look at sports is a little bit different from the way a lot of people look at sports. For me, sports is not just recreation. Sports is also something to take a look at in terms of development of human minds and intellectual capacity. Now, you'll be very surprised that rather than the country just being a country that's, with agile population that can jump, that can run, we can use sports also to understand that healthy body in a sound mind, in a sound body. These are the kind of things. But again, you realize that actually, there's absolutely no nation that cannot really go and become at least a hub, even if they are not themselves producing the sportsmen. They can become a hub for sports. And if Qatar at that time chooses as a strategic thing, because we realize that sports is really big business, you'll be very surprised that a cooperation with a country like Nigeria, with its huge population and that's demographically advantageous in terms of the youth that are able to engage in sporting activities, will be an excellent combination that can make and bring the focus of the world into such places.
All right, now let's make reference to the most controversial aspect of the meeting, which was the statement credited to the president, where he said that any official that demands bribe should be reported to him. There are those who argue that that statement, went further to demarcate Nigeria. What's your take on this?
You see, any statement can be perceived in two ways. It depends on the way you look at things. A glass is either half empty or half full. It's a game of perception. If you took a snapshot of the glass, it depends on who's looking at it. But if you look at the dynamics, then you determine whether indeed the glass is half empty or the glass is half full. So when somebody says you are demarketing Nigeria, I disagree with that. The fact is that, is it true that Nigeria, particularly people in positions of power and influence, always attempt to get gratification, even from Nigerians and foreigners? The answer is an absolute yes. So why do we want to deny the reality? I think we know this. As a matter of fact, if you Googled Nigeria right now, it's unfortunate whether we like it or not. Unfortunately, contrary to the kind of narratives that you and I would like, you will hear Nigeria is associated with terrible things. So this is the current narrative. We may not like it, but that's the way the world currently perceives us. And I think the job of the president is to try and rebrand the country. And I think the very first way to do this, rather than attempting to say, oh no, Nigerians are not this, yes, We say, well, even when the narrative says this, we say, yes, it is what the world says, but that's not who we are. And I think what he has done is to say that even if this were to happen, report them to me, and we know what to do. Now, any country that has strong capacity to uncover and to sanction bad behavior becomes a country that is going to be invariably governed by the rule of law. So, to my mind, I do not think it is a bad thing that he has said. The man has not said that, oh, Nigerians are going to take bribe, so please, that's part of our lives. No, what he's saying is that if it ever happens, report it to the highest authority and I will deal with it. I think that's not a bad thing. I myself am a chief executive, and sometimes I attend meetings, particularly when you are selling hard things. The kind of business I do is not the kind of business regular Nigerians do. I'm in software business. A lot of people do not believe Nigerians can do software. And when I go for meetings, people say, oh, we don't think Nigerians have the capacity to do this. I have two ways of addressing it. I could either go into it and try arguing with them that Nigerians have the capacity to do that. But I know that that will probably get me nowhere. So the way I do it is I say, okay, let's assume that we do not have the capacity to do it. The right question to ask is, can we get the capacity to do it? And if we agree that we can have the capacity to do it, then why don't we do it at this time? And I think that's what the president has done here. To my mind, I think he did well.
All right, since we're looking at statements, let's also look at the statement credited to the Emir of the Qatar state, where he talked about when he first traveled to Nigeria in 2019. And then he said that he traveled to Nigeria in 2019 owing to his belief that Nigeria is an important and strategic ally on its own and within the context of its role in regional affairs. That seems like an endorsement for Nigeria. What does this endorsement mean for the country?
Absolutely. So let's get something clear. You see, when we discuss the reality of productivity and we discuss market behaviors, these are two different things sometimes, particularly in the short run. Markets are driven solely by perception, actually. And so every company, every entity, every country wants to do one thing, and that is to have a good reputation. That is to have in fact, many countries are not even really interested in character, but reputation, and reputation is what they want to deal with, brand. So when you have the markets endorsing or saying to you that we think you are important, then that's a good thing. Then what behoves us is to ride on that momentum that's in our favor and put our feet on the throttle and ensure that this perception doesn't blow away. And what do we need to do? We just need to make sure that we are doing all the right things to ensure that this perception continues to have the grounds. And how do we do that? We begin to show in reality that what you believe we could do, we actually can do better. So I think that's a very smart thing for the country. It's a very positive development for Nigeria.
So the agreements that have been signed, it means that work will begin to go on, continuous talks between both governments to see what they can start with and how they can commence. All right, let's look at the collaboration between Nigeria in terms of solid minerals development. The solid minerals industry in Nigeria has not been what it should be. With Qatar coming on board, what development or what improvement is it expected to give it?
Well, you know, solid minerals, like any other extractive resources, are supposed to create wealth. Now, there's a theory called resource-based theory, okay? And what the resource-based theory propounds is to say that organizations that have access to more resources are likely to do better than organizations that have less resources, all right? And when we talk about organizations, it extends to nations. And so if you took a look at the data, And people have asked these questions, whether Nigeria is a poor country or whether Nigeria is a rich country. And the correct answer is it depends on which index that you are using to measure the riches or poverty. So if you look at it from primary indices, which talks about the potential, then you appreciate that Nigeria is perhaps the second richest nation in the world, or maybe the third richest nation in the world, potentially. And how do we measure that? We measure that by the quantum of resources, natural resources. And a lot of these natural resources include what you refer to rightly as solid minerals. But when you then go to the tertiary index of GDP at the end of the day, in terms of human capital development, then you realize that Nigeria is actually an extremely poor nation. And the question is, what has happened is that through the years, though Nigeria has been rich in resources, which suggests that potentially Nigeria has the capacity to grow and become exceedingly wealthy. The challenge is the disconnect between the channeling of the resources or the proceeds of these resources into the welfare and development of the human beings. That's what has been so far in Nigeria. I mean, if you take a look at it, oil is one of those things that Nigeria has done pretty well with. But again, because there's something we call the Dutch disease, because of the oil which came upon us, which made us maybe a little bit too easy, too comfortable, we refused to look into other areas that could have given Nigeria much leverage. So here we are talking about solid minerals. The solid minerals that we have in Nigeria actually do have perhaps even higher potential than oil and gas. However, it may need more work than oil and gas. So you might then want to say, okay, fine, if Nigeria missed the bus with oil and gas, perhaps we can make amendments by exploiting our mineral resources, solid mineral resources, and hope that this time around we get it right, realizing that whatever the proceeds we are getting from the mining activities of solid minerals must necessarily be diverted into national development. And to that extent, I think that it is not a bad thing, because the solid minerals will remain solid minerals just under the ground, except they are exploited, except we have capacity to mine them. And this is what we are trying to do by having this kind of agreements to ensure that indeed these deposits, which are potential monies for us, become kinetic and actual money for us. And I think that if we do the right things, it's going to create tremendous wealth for this country. The only thing we hope is that when that happens, we again utilize the wealth that has been created in appropriate manners to create bigger potentials for the future.
Interesting. And now let's look at the issue of tourism. I put this to you: what kind of exchange of values should happen between Nigeria and Qatar when it comes to tourism? Looking at what that nation has done with tourism, what are the lessons for Nigeria? What kind of template do you think Nigeria can adopt, and how impactful will that be for Nigeria?
Femi, you have asked a very huge question. And if we take a look at the snapshot today in terms of tourism between Nigeria and Qatar, it will appear that that is going to be heavily lopsided, in the sense that today we likely are going to see more Nigerians going into Qatar for tourism than more Qatarians or other people coming into Nigeria for tourism. But that is the reality. But let's take a look at what the possibilities and the potentials are. If you take a look at what the possibilities and the potentials are, and we can learn even from Qatar themselves, and we then begin to realize that Nigeria has very huge potentials in tourism. For example, I mean, there are not very many countries in the world that have the number of interesting historical sites that we have in Nigeria. Secondly, Nigeria is also blessed with so many, in fact, what people call some wonders of the world. So, for example, we all travel overseas. We want to go and see the Grand Canyon. We want to go see the Niagara Falls. We want to go see the Victoria Falls. But there is the Ijesha waterfalls in Nigeria. the challenge why Nigeria hasn't been able to do much with tourism, unfortunately, are in two areas. One is we do not even have the transportation network to be able to allow either Nigerians or foreigners to be able to travel to these very beautiful landmarks. And we have not yet understood how to create ecosystems around these interesting landmarks. And of course, today Nigerians are a lot worried about safety and security. So these things need to be taken care of. Now, if we took good care of these things, allowed ensure capacity or capability of people to be able to fly into Lagos and be able to drive all the way down to the Binigate Cave in the east, or drive all the way down to the Enijesha waterfalls, and drive all the way down or fly easily to the Obudukatu Ranch, you would begin to see that Nigeria does have a lot of potentials. There are many countries. Many people go to Seychelles. Many people go to the Caribbean. Perhaps the only thing that a good number of these countries have is tourism. And if you take a look at even the United Arab Emirates, it started with oil and gas. After a while, they really went a lot full blast into tourism. And you realize that tourism is a very, very intricate thing. So they went along, even though they will tell you that their airline Emirates is not state-owned, I believe them, but it is state-supported, it is state-enabled. Nigeria needs to take a look at these kind of things. Do we have a national carrier that is either state-owned or state-enabled? Do we have the road networks? Do we have the security? Then we again need to look at people who become tour guides. There are so many countries in the world where teeming young men and ladies become experts and they make a lot of money in tourism. I mean, the other time I even just in Egypt, and they took us, and they took us to the pyramids, and then right after the pyramids, they took us somewhere. After they had shown you how the mummies are created, talk about the oil that have been used, talk about this, and they take you to shops just close to the place. And I was there with a few friends, and I have an idea how many thousands of dollars were spent on buying just oil. That's the meaning of tourism. And that's how, and then you then leave that place, then they take you to their national museum, and then you go take a look. And I think the biggest attraction in these places are their the Egyptian mummies. A whole lot of things are going on there. So I think Nigeria actually does have a lot of potential in tourism. But again, we have a lot of work to do if this is going to become kinetic. And I think we can borrow a template from Qatar. Qatar was just a desert. All they did was they used their monies that they were getting from crude, and they used it to develop their deserts into somewhere that's so beautiful that the rest of the world wants to go see. And again, part of tourism, like I said, I talked about airline. So you take a look at it. So look at what the Emirates has done. So even if you are not visiting Dubai, their airline has been so made in a manner that Dubai has become a hub. Everybody from all over the world, you see yourself in Dubai International Airport. And when you are in Dubai International Airport, you're going to buy a drink, you're going to have a meal, you're going to go to duty free, you're going to, and definitely you buy something. Why can't Nigeria be the hub, at least in Africa? Africa is still looking for that hub. Take a look at it today. If I have experienced it before. I needed to go to Tunisia. I was flying from South Africa. I needed to first of all fly into Paris from South Africa before going to Tunis. Where is that coming from? Why can't Nigeria? And if you take a look at the position of Nigeria and in the map, actually in the world map and in the map of Africa, you see that Nigeria is very, very naturally well positioned to be a hub for tourism.
All right, looking further into Nigeria harnessing its potential, the federal government of Nigeria is set to harness the $350 billion global outsourcing market for youth employment. It plans to do this with the launch of the Outsource to Nigeria initiative. Now, what are some of the tasks and services that you think can be outsourced to Nigeria?
Now, let's take a look at the outsourcing industry today. What actually happens? And again, we should have asked a question very clearly, Blessing. that how did we even lose out? How did India suddenly take over outsourcing from Nigeria? Look at the factors that affect outsourcing are, number one, the capacity to communicate. Number two, the capacity to have human beings that have the English being a natural language. And then most importantly, youth that are reasonably well educated. And then of course, very, very importantly, the communication in terms of internet, in terms of how solid do we have. Nigeria today, we already have a lot of undersea cables that have landed in Nigeria. That's a good advantage for us. Secondly, we have a very good, huge population of youth in Nigeria that have capacity to learn, even if they are not yet there. So even today, you realize that even drivers, even today, you go to companies, even gate men, they speak good English. A good number of them went to school. The market is ready for us. And I think one important thing, like we said earlier, is what is the brand of the country. I think the outsourcing market is still huge, and I think it is waiting for Nigeria to grab it. We have what it takes. We have the people. We speak good English. Look at our position, longitude 0, meaning that in terms of time to Europe, same time, even to America, not too far. And if you want to service the East, and one of the things I will say is that there is no economy in the world that wants to advance, that begins working at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock and shuts down at 5. No economy prospers that way. We need to begin to understand that we need to have a 24-hour economy. And that is what we can do in outsourcing. Outsourcing has a whole lot of potential in terms of job creation. We can actually, and for me, I think it is something that we really, really need to take a very good look at and ask ourselves, how did we lose out to India?
All right, talking about the outsourcing industry globally, what should be the starting point for Nigeria now that there seems to be a resolve to taking advantage of the potential inherent in that industry? How specifically can you be geared towards creating jobs for the teeming unemployed young people in Nigeria? Making reference to your own example, where you also started your own business with about $60 with your colleagues. Most of the challenges being faced by young people in Nigeria is the capital to start their businesses. So how will this be channeled towards helping these young people, not just being employed, but creating jobs as well?
Thank you. You see, the honest truth is that when we look at it from an economic model, all right, the economic model talks about the factors of production, that talks about land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. All right. And so when we look at it purely from that, the way we were taught in the classrooms in economics, and people tend to look at capital solely as financial capital. But I beg to differ as an entrepreneur. If you really unpack capital, you realize that capital can be unpacked into 3 segments. So you have financial capital, which is very popular and which a lot of people deal with, and they talk about venture capital, we talk about private equity, we talk about all that. That's good and very sound. Without money, you can do very little. However, but there are other 2 important ingredients of capital, and they are intellectual capital and emotional capital. Never take those away. In truth, and it is the correct thing you have said, that PFS started 30 years ago. We were 30 on Friday. Last Friday, PFS turned 30. And we started business with 8,250 naira, which was about $60 at that time. And since that day, nobody has given us an injection of capital. And the company has not only survived, but become a multi-million-dollar concern. And we have operations in more than 45 countries today. So you ask yourself, how did PFS do that? It is purely on the abundance of intellectual and emotional capital. Intellectual and emotional capital in a knowledge economy will necessarily create financial capital. And that's the bottom line. And that's why I say that as a country, and the younger people need to understand this, that we need to move away from extractive business to knowledge business. PFS has done it. I am a living example and a living testimony to the fact that you can actually start a business very small and make the business become global. Once you have the capacity to create, because the bottom line is everything that we see is created from what is not seen. That's the meaning of intellectual capacity. So all the products that PFS created were not seen, they were not visible, they were all in the minds of human beings. And we just brought them to life to create not only employment, but to create tremendous wealth. If one person has done it, it is transitive. Anybody can do it under the right conditions.
Okay, let's get back to your question on how did Nigeria lose out to India in the global outsourcing market. Let's look at what has worked for India. Now, they started ahead of time to position the country as a destination for outsourcing. And let's look at Nigeria too. It's beginning to start to do that right now. And then the issue of skills gap. India has for a very long time been focusing on human capital development, particularly in the IT sector. What has Nigeria done in that regard? Now, if Nigeria is to be significant in the global outsourcing market, what are the steps it needs to take right now?
Well, you see, if you look at the value chain of the outsourcing market, it's going to be interesting actually, because it's going to go beyond individual capacity, and you have used the right analogies of what India did. India deliberately positioned itself because, like I said, India, by even their location, even by their accent, is probably not what people would naturally consider. But what India did was to position, to say, hey, we have a lot of youth that have the capacity, and they talk about technology training. Let me say this to you with that, and I don't intend to complicate anything. Outsourcing does not necessarily equate to high technology. Outsourcing work, for example, when you make a call to your airline or you make a call to your even telephone provider, sometimes you realize that a number of those calls are terminated in India. Just call centers. All these people really need to understand is not necessarily technology. They just need to have an understanding of the business that they are supporting. What the entrepreneurs need to provide, yes, is technology in the sense that they need to provide an enabling technology that allows calls to be able to terminate remotely anywhere you are making the calls from. But in terms of the operators and operational people, they don't necessarily even need to be high-tech people. They just need to be able to communicate effectively. They need to be able to think fast in an analytical manner, and to be able to have the right mindset for care. When you talk about customer care, to make the customer that is calling to be comfortable. I think these are the ingredients for the kind of people you want to employ. But for the kind of people that are going to start the business, I agree that there's a need for a lot of investment in technology. Now, the question is, when I look at that value chain, India has done itself a whole lot of favor by ensuring that a lot of the technology behind the call centers, behind the outsourcing is created in India. And therefore, they extract a lot of value as a nation from those things. The question is whether Nigeria is ready for that now or not. And I can tell you right now that yes, Nigeria may not be ready today, but does Nigeria have the capability to get ready and to be able to compete in 5 to 10 years? My answer without any equivocation is yes. But it's going to require discipline, it's going to require competence, and it's going to require tenacity.
The Vice President is expected to launch another program today in this regard, a program called Outsource to Nigeria Initiative. Now, what should be done differently this time around to ensure that this program achieves the purpose intended? Not just like any other program whereby the enthusiasm to start is there, but the mechanism to see it through is not being put in place. So what should be done differently this time around?
Femi, again, you have asked a very deep, intelligent question. Because you see, in business, there are two types of failures. We have the type 1 and the type 2 failures. Type 1 failures are the ones that don't even take off. You know, the thing fails just before takeoff. And there are so many reasons why that can happen. Improper dimensioning of this challenge, where perhaps, in fact, sometimes a good product to a good challenge that came before its time That's the reason why a business can fail even, before takeoff. But the other one that we see a lot is what I call the type 2 failures, are the ones where everything is even, the ground is level, everything is already set up for you, and yet you are unable to do many things. And that's where you see many organizations that come into markets with a lot of hype, with a lot of media buzz, with a lot of money thrown behind them, and in just 2-3 years, these companies go into oblivion. Now, that's the bigger challenge that I want us to pay attention to today, because if at the level of the vice presidency, we are beginning to talk about outsourced Nigeria, that suggests to me that some reasonable resources have been made available to this particular campaign. However, the reason why we can fail is when invariably people then say, let's even give you a try, and you are unable to deliver. That becomes a big disaster that, God forbid, we run into. And the way to do this, to avoid that kind of a thing, is my own idea, might not necessarily, and this is the way the Eastern countries will do it. They would first of all get the capacity, test their capacity first. When they have tested and they know and they feel reasonably convinced that they can deliver, then they go market it. Some other countries, particularly in the West, would go market it and then take money for marketing it and then use the money to develop the capacity to develop it. There's no right or wrong. However, one thing that is constant with the two of them is that the capacity to develop must be paid, attention must be paid to capacity to deliver. If we fail to pay attention to capacity to deliver, there's absolutely no way. It is true you can, for a short time, for a very short period of time, package a rat like an elephant and sell it to the world, but after a while, the world will know that that elephant cannot really be an elephant. And that's the worst disaster for any entity. And I really do hope that Nigeria doesn't fall into that disaster. The only way we're going to do this, ensure that we have capacity and we build the capacity and we are committed to continuous improvements.
That's some packaging there when you package a rat to look like an elephant. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Yele Okeremi, for ending with that. It's funny, but yes, it can happen, and it's really true that we pay attention to the important things. We've been talking with Dr. Yele Okeremi, who is the MD CEO of Precise Financial Systems, PFS, and it's been a wonderful show you've given us today. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Listen, Femi. See you again sometime again in the future. Bye.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.